construction makers.
So what is Kingmaking?
Kingmaking is when you have a game where you're playing with 3 or more players, and each of those players has agency over being able to determine who the winner is, even if they are not going to be the one that wins.
This play pattern emerges in games where you have more than 2 sides, right? So you could have teams, but if you have 3 teams, you're going to have this problem.
Right.
You could have 3 players, you could have 4 players, you could have 5 players.
Yeah.
If there's more than 2 sides, like, us versus them, if it's us versus them and them, that's when you're going to run into this problem. Mainly because when 2 people are interacting and expending resources fighting, the third person can sit out and do nothing.
Yes.
And in fact, that's probably the best strategy.
Right. Don't engage, pretend like you're not there, and they'll move on.
So why is this a problem?
Well, I think anyone that's ever played any game of, let's say, Munchkin would know. What's a more common example? Because Munchkin, I think a lot of people have played Munchkin, but it's probably not as, common. Is there a good,
Commander Magic.
We can't talk about that. We talked about that once. We can't talk about Commander Magic. We're not allowed to talk about it. People got mad at us. Yes, Commander Magic does this, and Commander Magic has Kingmaking. What I think is interesting, and that I think is important to point out, and I think a lot of people will probably did point out during our Commander Magic video, is that every free-for-all multiplayer game has this problem.
Yeah.
The only way they don't have this problem is if you are all playing solitaire.
Right.
Then you have no interaction. You cannot directly interact with what the other players are doing.
It's just sort of like a race where there's no interaction between.
Right.
It's like you're almost like swimming or something, right? Where you're all in your own lanes,
yes,
and there's no interaction between you. You're just racing to the finish.
And what you'll hear from most players that play a game that's like that, because there are games that are like that, is a lot of people end up saying, yeah, I enjoyed myself, but I don't feel like I really, it didn't feel like we were really playing together in some way.
Yeah.
So every game, it might be probably too broad to say every good game has some form of kingmaking in that way, because whether or not you like solitaire or not is entirely up to you. Personally, I don't really like those types of games. So any game that has any form of interaction between other players will have a problem with kingmaking.
Let's say we want to design a game that is a free-for-all multiplayer. One example, I guess maybe we should just talk about some ways to combat this idea. Part of the reason why we call it a cursed problem is that there really isn't a solution, right? Like if you are designing a free-for-all multiplayer game, this is part of the deal.
Right.
And then you should be designing systems to interact with this and
be to alleviate
some of the problem. Yeah.
And I think like Munchkin is an example. You see a lot of games, and I don't know if there's a genre for it, but most people online just call them shit on you games.
Right. Yeah. Take that.
Take that. Yes. Yeah. Thank you. That's the genre. I prefer shit on you.
Yeah, shit on you is pretty good.
But yes, take that games is that might have been my own definition for it. And really, it's that anytime someone starts getting close to winning, every other player at that table, could be like an 8-player Munchkin game, whatever, they're all going to start messing with that one person. And so even if you were this close to winning, you're now probably the furthest from winning. And it's not a fun time. It doesn't feel great.
Right. So we can talk about some of the strategies, I guess, that end up emerging. Like if you don't do anything about this as a game designer, your players will figure out a way to try to combat this on their own.
Yeah.
And some of those strategies are what you're talking about. One is not playing, which is a big problem. One is being sneaky. A lot of people just try to be sneaky, and they try to do as little as possible, or play things in a way that makes it look like they're not ahead, and act like they're not doing anything. Right? It's actually do nothing or act like you're doing nothing.
Right.
You also never want to be like the person who's in the lead or the person who's in last. Right. You want to be you want to look like you're somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
And like This happens a lot in Commander Magic. We're just going to end up bringing that up a bit.
I was gonna say, if you're curious, look at any what I would assume CEDH player is probably doing in Commander Magic, and they're probably players that are very good at doing this type of a thing.
Right. There's a lot of getting other people to expend their resources like you basically want to expend as few resources as possible while everybody else is expending more.
Right. Which I do want to say that can be fun. Like
Sure.
that can be fun.
Right.
The problem is, I think, when it's unintended to what the game systems is actually meant to be.
Right.
Right. There are games that encourage that type of behavior. Right. Like if you were to look at any sort of an asymmetrical, secret, hidden identity game, they want that type of behavior because that's the game. The game is the dialogue between players. Right. But in a game that's, more free for all, like Commander Magic or something like that, it's never intended. There's no card effect that says, oh, pretend to do this or keep this hidden so that other players can do this or whatever. Like it's all something of how the players are reacting to the information on the board. Right.
And that's an interesting distinction that you bring up, is that when we have a hidden identity game, this is a type of game that has kind of solved this issue, sort of. When you look at Secret Hitler, you technically have two sides.
Yeah.
But what's interesting about it is that the resource that you're expending isn't actually like something that's going to keep you from winning the game or not, right? It can if you give away too much information, but in some ways they're leaning into the secrecy part of it, right? Anyway, some other ways that players might try to hedge against this, most of it's inaction. Like if we look at battle royales again, that's like the FOO strategy, first order optimal, FOO strategy. Basically just means the first strategy that players would think of. And what comes up in battle royales is I'm just going to avoid everybody. I'm going to go hide in a shack and hope that the circle that's enclosing around me closes around that shack, and then I can last till almost the end of the game. I might even win. But yeah, that obvious first strategy that comes up in these things.
It's how I play.
Right. Yeah.
I'm not good at them.
Right. Okay. I think that's the really big problematic strategies that might come up. There's probably some stuff that I'm missing, but I think it's more important that we talk about what are some ways and some solutions that have been designed to try to alleviate this problem.
I think the big one, the biggest way that anybody alleviates this is usually by having the goal of the game be some form of indirect interaction. Primarily, and I mean, by this time, we'll probably have our video that has come out talking about where we laid out objectives of a game and gameplay loops, I think is what we talked about. And so the way that I'd classify this type of game is mastery. Which is what Catan is. Catan is a game that once you reach 10 points, you win, right?
Right.
So how do you reach 10 points? Well, there's a few ways, but you build enough settlements, you have longest road, etc., and you get points that way.
Right.
But if you're building a road to try and build a settlement, it might intersect someone else's road. Mm-hmm. You are not directly stopping that person by... You're not pinpointing, right? You're not saying you can't build a road everywhere, right? You can't just build a road right at someone's settlement if they're halfway across the map from you.
Right.
You have to build it along your own road, along your own settlement, so you do not have direct decision of who you are going to say take that. Right? That is indirect interaction.
Right.
And I think that's how most games end up getting around this.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the best solutions is to create a system of indirect interaction, meaning there's almost a surrogate player, let's say, in the middle of the board, where it's just a way to illustrate how this works. You have some kind of King of Tokyo is a great example.
King of Tokyo, yeah.
Where Tokyo is this, right? There's if you're in Tokyo and you do damage to everyone. So your means of interacting with other players is amplified by interacting with this thing that's in the middle of the table, right? And any player can do that. It's just in King of Tokyo, you take turns doing that. You could design a system in which at any point in time, someone could interact with that thing in the middle of the table and have it interact with everyone else. Counting up, like having it be a race is a good way to do that. Things that count up to a total number of points, right? You could look at that as there's a pile of coins in the middle of the table, and we're trying to take all of those coins, and then once all the coins are gone, we each look and go, who has the most coins, right? Right. That's just sort of the reverse of counting up for everybody or whatever, right?
Right.
But having that means of interaction in the middle of the table can be deeper than just how you win the game, right? You can create, for instance, in my game, Bullets and Teeth,
right.
you can create a third-party enemy in the middle of the table that is the thing that can kill everyone. And if you're interacting with that thing in the middle of the table, by you saving yourself, sometimes you're actually making it easier for other people. So you're there's almost a backwards logic where you're like, well, I want to survive, but I want to survive in the way that kills the least number of zombies in the middle of the table so that the next person who has to deal with them has a harder time.
Right.
Right. And so it becomes like that's sort of like almost, second order strategy where you're like, okay, first is survive, second is survive and make sure other people are going to have a harder time. Another way that you can try to combat this is through variance, mainly randomness, but other options as choice variance and things like that. But when you look at Smash Bros, if we're looking at something that is a more real-time game, battle royales too, with their ring that closes in combats this somewhat, but not. I think Smash Bros actually does a bit better job combating this idea. Is that when you have multiple people fighting each other, let's say there's 4 players, and you have two players fighting each other, and the other 2 are standing further away from them, random items start to drop, and these items create an asymmetry. In that it's a catch-up mechanic, right? It's a way for someone who's been beaten down by another player, 2 players have been fighting each other, now they get items, now they can go after the other players, or items that affect all the players.
I was going to say, the minute that you pick up the hammer, right,
right,
you're invincible and you're just whacking people. Suddenly,
the hammer's a great, perfect example.
There's literally no reason for you to hide because now you're the threat and you can go and attack them.
Yeah, and it's also very obvious. Like the items in Smash Bros that do this kind of thing, like there's no mistaking them. Yeah. The music changes. There's flashing lights. Or sometimes it's, I have this big special ability and now the camera's focused on me even and I'm doing the special ability. Those are, I guess, some examples of how you can combat this.
Yeah.
There are certain games that reportedly lean into this. Root being one of them.
Right.
In that, Cole Worley has described the game as a Kingmaking game, and he basically is talking about how he wants his abstract systems to represent that part of life, that Kingmaking is part of life, and the negotiation between players and choosing whether or not to do something that's advantageous to someone or have somebody else win the game is all part of life, and so games should mimic that behavior.
Right. And I think that's interesting, and I think that, we played Root not that long ago. It was earlier this year. I think that when we played, I definitely noticed that feeling, and it didn't bother me. I think that's something that people look down on with Kingmaking, is that when Kingmaking was kind of going around in game design and discussions, and it was talked about very much like, oh, you want to avoid it at all costs. You want to alleviate it as much as possible. And I don't think that's necessarily the way of looking at it, because Kingmaking, no matter what, like we're saying, it's a cursed problem. It is inevitable. Any game that you make that is free-for-all multiplayer, that has any form of interaction with other players, which you probably want interaction to make the game probably more engaging, is going to have this problem. Now, how much of that problem is entirely up to you. And in fact, you could be someone that likes Munchkin. You could be someone that likes a take that game. And so you would lean into that direct interaction. Yeah. Or you could, handle it something similar to Root, in that you do have some of that direct interaction and you kind of encourage it, and you have it actually part of the story, as part of the storytelling. What I love about Root is everybody's first impression of Root is when you first start playing, whoever plays Marquis the cat. If you're not familiar, look up Root and look up just the first playthrough. You could find the digital version. Marquis the cat is the orange character, and the cat is all over the map.
Yeah.
And so everyone immediately is like, we got to take out the cat.
Right.
And what's so funny is that being able to do that, you can actually make whoever's playing Marquis the cat technically stronger in the beginning. Because if you are illustrating to the players that this person is powerful, they're widespread, they're strong, then everyone's going to go for that one threat. And so it's almost sort of tricking players into figuring out who's in Tokyo, right?
Right.
And then it sort of naturally adapts from there. And skilled players might see Marquis the cat in its position and go, okay, like they're strong, but if we do this, we can keep them, tempered, and they're not going to be overwhelming us or anything like that.
Right. I think one of the other things that I want to bring up is that one of the sort of prevailing opinions about this design problem is that it doesn't matter and that players are the ones that should be figuring out how to solve this.
Yeah.
And
what game are you talking about?
Well, lots of multiplayer games, specifically Commander Magic.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But I mean, the thing is, like, it's such an interesting opinion because I think in some ways it is correct. You can design a game that says, okay, players, I'm leaving this into your hands and your own play groups are going to figure this out. So knowing it's there, working with it in the way that you want to, if you want to just keep it in the game, like say Root, you need to design your player expectations in a way that they will expect it, right? Yeah. And be okay with the story unfolding in that way. Smash Bros. Does a good job too because it is portraying itself as a very casual game. Right. And you'll notice that when Smash Bros. Is played in a tournament, it's 1v1 with no items.
Right. And it plays just fine that way too.
Right.
That's
and
what's great.
That's some of the brilliant design of Smash Bros. Is that it's part of it. There's lots of great design in Smash Bros. But it's that the game can be modified to be played in a way that casual players can enjoy and competitive players can enjoy, and those systems are in the game, and you as the player, your group gets to then decide what that looks like. And Commander Magic can work that way too, but it's just not as clear, right? Smash Bros, it's like really obvious, and you're changing the fundamental rules of the game to function the way that your group wants it to. Right. Where in Commander Magic, you're all designing your own stuff and then bringing it together, and there's hidden information and that you don't know what's going to come out of the other player's deck.
Right. I mean, Smash Bros. Is even better, even greater than that. Because I think my favorite thing about Smash Bros. Is that even if you have it as a free-for-all multiplayer, there's always friendly fire. And so even if you get 3 players and there's 1 player and the 3 players say, let's get him, and you start going at him, if there's a Mario and one of the 3 players and he's throwing fireballs, those fireballs are going to hit whoever they hit.
Anybody.
Right?
Yeah.
So even if you decide, we're all going to band together and get them, like, it's such chaos and mayhem that you're never really in control over whether or not that person's going to win. And again, it is also with the items, obviously, right? So if someone ends up picking up the hammer and they're just going for 1 player, they might end up hitting a different player if they get in their way or something.
Right. Yep.
And I think games that know when to lean into that sort of casual, like, chaos, I think is for the better. Like, I think King of Tokyo does that really, really well. Mm-hmm. In that King of Tokyo talked a bit about how, like, Catan is like a mastery game, and King of Tokyo technically has 2 goals. You could either get 20 points, or you could do how most games end, which is you're the last person standing.
Be the last one standing.
And it knows that if it didn't have the last person standing, the game's pretty boring.
Right.
We've played a version, basically, where it isn't the last person standing, and it's not nearly as exciting. When you have that constant threat of being able to die or get out in some way, it's very scary, and it's like nerve-wracking, right? Mm-hmm. Every new dice roll is very, very exciting. But it is casual. It's a very, like, casual game. But I do think it's interesting because I see a lot of people that are either designing new games, or I've seen people make attempts to design some games that are this sort of free-for-all multiplayer game, and they really want it to be competitive.
Yeah.
And those two things, it's
tough.
They won't. I don't think it works.
I mean, battle royales work as competitive, apparently. But I think a lot of that has to do with the real time. Like, there's, when decision making has that kind of pressure on it, I think you can get away with a lot more. When you're in a free for all multiplayer environment that's turn based, it's really easy to know what someone's doing at any given point in time. Where in, like, a battle royale that's real time, there could be people hiding all over the place. You wouldn't know they're there.
Right.
But if everybody's sitting at the same table together, you can tell what people are doing.
Right. I also think that, in a battle royale, I think the idea of most of the time, most skirmishes are only two teams against each other, right? Because it is the smarter decision to stand back or run away.
Right.
It's not smart to engage and be a third party now in this whole skirmish. That's a dumb thing to do. You might wait till the skirmish is over and then engage. But again, that's just one team versus another team.
Yeah.
It's not this asymmetrical chaos.
Cool. Okay, so Kingmaking, it's a thing.
It is a thing. It's hard to design for. Not that I'd know from personal experience.